Right, hi. So the previous talks discussed how bridges can be defended, and those are great talks. So I'm going to talk about how bridges break, just to add some color to it and understand how it can happen. So I'm not going to talk much about how bridges work because this was already covered. I just mentioned that in every bridge there is someone moving information from one chain to the other and guarantees its correctness by some mechanism. So let's talk about how it breaks. In the past couple of years, we've seen many bridge hacks. And the reason is always that wrong information was conveyed to one of the chains. So the reasons can be split to a few categories. One could be insufficient or improper validation, either insufficient or just relying on some source such as another smart contract without understanding its full implications. Another common one is malleable proofs, meaning that messages can be replayed, that there was a correct message, but it is played more than once. And then there's making wrong assumptions about one or more network. And of course, finally, there's the good old key compromise or validator compromise. So what happens when a bridge breaks? The obvious answer is funds get stolen, user funds, investor funds, depending on the model. But there's more to it. For example, if assets get minted on one side without assets locked on the other one and the bridge goes out of balance, it can have interesting implications on collateralized protocols. And it gets even more interesting when it comes to message bridges like Nomad, because then other protocols can use it to communicate cross-chain. For example, to have cross-chain governance, where a contract can be upgraded on one chain through a vote on another chain, and in such case, if the bridge breaks, then entire protocols can get hijacked. So let's go through a few examples. We start with a trivial one. So DeFi is it's a bridge aggregator, and as such, it lets the user select a path, select a route. This means technically that the user gets to decide which function in which contract gets called. The user controls the call data and the target for DeFi, and it's meant to call bridges. But what if it calls a different contract? For example, what if it calls a token contract, an ERC20 contract, and tells it to transfer assets from the bridge itself? So this is exactly what happened here. And so that was a relatively simple attack. Another interesting example was Multichain, or formerly called AnySwap. In AnySwap, tokens get wrapped on the way in and unwrapped on the way out. And the wrap token happens to support the permit method. In order to facilitate single transaction transfers. So the contract expects to get a token that supports permit, and permit is supposed to reject. It's defined that it will always reject, always revert on if the signature is bad, if the signature is incorrect. So it should be safe. But note that the user is the one providing the token address. So the user could deploy a contract deploy a contract that returns a token with no permit support. And why would that be bad? So we said that permit should revert but permit should revert. But if it's not defined, if permit is not defined in the contract, then the result is undefined. And if it happens to be if the contract happens to have a fallback function that does not revert, then permit actually always succeeds. It becomes a no-op. And it turns out that there are some popular tokens that satisfy these requirements, such as wrapped ETH. Now, we can see that the user also controls the from address. So the user can decide which address to use. And if it happens to be an address that previously approved such token in order to use AnySwap, then the contract can withdraw any number of tokens from this address, and that's what happened here. So in this example, we saw reliance on an external contract for checking for the truth, and it was actually a user-provided contract, which is generally a bad idea. Okay. Nomad is a particularly interesting example because, as I said, it's an optimistic bridge for passing general messages, not just tokens. So it allows cross-chain communication for protocols that use it, such as governance messages, and of course the transfer of assets. And the way it works is it has validators. It has validators who attest for Merkle roots cross-chain, and then the user proves the message against such a Merkle root. So in July this year, the Nomad contracts underwent an update. Before that, they actually had a correct check that wouldn't be vulnerable. They checked if the hash existed, and if the message doesn't exist, then the result would be 0 and the process would fail. After the upgrade in July, it became possible to call acceptable root with 0. And if we look at acceptable root, we see that it doesn't check for 0. All it checks is that the entry exists, meaning that it has time, a non-zero time. And here's how the contract was initialized. So after the upgrade, they called this initialize, and it seems that they passed 0. So 0 was inserted to confirm at, and now it has a non-zero time. It has 1. What this means is that any message can now be processed without proving it. Yeah. So now it's possible to fake messages. And what happened during the attack? So the attacker started using such messages. In order to move funds, to withdraw funds from the bridge. And this is, what's interesting is that instead of just doing it through flash bots and trying to drain it as soon as possible, the attacker actually used the public mempool and started, which means that MEV bots automatically started sniping this transaction and replicating it. So all of a sudden, thousands of addresses are withdrawing from the bridge, and most of them are automated bots. So this makes it quite difficult to know which one is the attacker and which ones are automated bots. I don't know if that was if that was what the attacker meant to do, but the result is quite interesting. So the reasons here were, first of all, the separation, the needless, in my opinion, separation between proving and processing, and then an upgrade that created insufficient validation, and finally, wrong initialization, calling the initializer with a bad parameter. Now, it's interesting to note that the bug in the new code was not exploitable in itself. And adding 0 also is not exploitable in itself. What happened here is the combination of both made it it's what made the attack possible. And curiously, this is not mentioned in any of the postmortems I've seen. I think it's an interesting combination. Right. Now, with the help of Optimism, I'd like to demonstrate two types of network level risks that bridges have to live with. So one of them is a great bug reported by Saurik to Optimism. We can see that when a bridge makes assumptions about the network and then something breaks at the network level, the bridge has no way to defend itself. So Optimism used to have so Optimism is based on the Geth Ethereum client with some modifications. One of the modifications used to be that the representation of Ether was not as a part of the account, but as an ERC20 contract. And then all the opcodes were modified to use this representation. Well, all except one, self-destruct. So when a contract self-destructs, the last act is to move the funds, to move the Ether to another account. And they moved the fund, but they didn't zero the balance in the destroyed account. So this means that after a self-destruct, the funds exist twice. Once in the destructed contract, and the other is in the address where it's sent to. Now, if the contract was created using the create2 opcode, then it's possible to recreate the contract. So an attacker could repeatedly create the contract and destroy it, thus minting an unlimited amount of L2 Ether. So in this example, we see that the basic assumption of no double spend was broken. And it means that every bridge would be exposed to such attack with all of the assets. First of all, the entire Ether supply on layer 1 in all the bridges would have been stolen by transferring a lot of L2 ETH out. And then the attacker will probably keep minting more L2 ETH in order to use it to buy all the tokens from all the dexes on the network, on the L2 network, and send it all out through the bridge. So luckily, no damage done. It was reported by Saurik and fixed by Optimism immediately. Now, another kind of risk is related to consensus, to assumptions about consensus. It was previously mentioned here that that consensus behaves differently on different networks, and in particular on optimistic rollups. So bridges have to assume finality within a relatively short time. It differs between bridges, but at some point they need to decide that something is final and release assets on the other side. And on optimistic rollups, the transactions are submitted by a sequencer. The state transitions are submitted by a sequencer. And what stops the sequencer from cheating, from submitting wrong state transitions, is the fraud proofs or fault proofs. So, and therefore, there's a 7 days window to prove that. And in case of a fraud proof or a fault proof, it causes a reorg. Can be a long-term reorg where the bad state transition gets reverted. So a bug in the proof system could cause a selective reorg up to 7 days in the past. And since bridges assume a faster finality, it can be quite disastrous for a bridge. So in OVM1, in Optimism's first implementation, I found a number of such bugs. Each of them allowed me to edit the result of a past transaction I submitted up to 7 days back. So such attack makes it possible to grab all the assets from all the bridges up to some multiplier on the liquidity that the attacker can bring, this multiplier can be quite big actually. I'll show why. So what the attacker would first do is send as much ETH as the attacker can get into the network, then transfer it back out through all of the bridges, and later, possibly much later, the attacker would revert these transactions using a malicious fraud proof. So now the attacker basically double spend. The attacker now has the L1 ETH released by the bridges, but also has the L2 ETH again, and the bridges have nothing. Now at that point, the attacker could amplify the attack by front running all the trades that happened on the network in the past 7 days. Since the attacker now has the benefit of hindsight, knowing about price changes, and only the attacker gets to use this arbitrage and perform trades. So that's why the multiplier can be quite big. So anyway, I reported this to Optimism. They immediately turned off fraud proofs and then started working on OVM2. So OVM1 has long been deprecated since, and OVM2 is much better. So no damage done, but the assumption remains risky, and not just for this network, for any network. So this is not unique to Optimism. Bridges basically have no way to defend themselves against long-term reorg. They need to be aware of it and try to mitigate the risk to the best they can. Now here's an interesting case. This is something that wasn't in production. So Arbitrum is an optimistic rollup, and shortly before production, I found an interesting bug in the code that is worth looking at. The reason it's worth looking at is that it's the opposite situation. One where a canonical bridge, one where the bridge is the one breaking the assumption. So the message bridge had an interesting property. When sending a message from layer 1 to layer 2 from a certain address, the transaction, it would create a transaction, it would create a direct call from the same address on layer 2. And note that the code in these two addresses, the code in these two contracts is not necessarily identical, because if they were created using the create opcode, using the same deployment key and the same nonce, then they would have the same address despite having different code. So this enables an attacker to create a legitimately looking DeFi project on layer 2, wait until it accumulates enough assets, and then and only then deploy a simple proxy on layer 1 and use this proxy to rug pull all the assets, to pull all the assets from the contract. So this broke another basic assumption from smart contracts, that a contract should never make calls that do not appear in its code. So anyway, Arbitrum discovered this while I was researching the bug, and it was actually fixed in the repo on the day I wrote the report. So that happens too. But it's still a nice demonstration of how a bridge can break assumptions and what will be the consequences. And last, I want to briefly look at Ronin. So Ronin is not a smart contract bridge. It's a trusted, centralized bridge based on a multisig. And so in this case, there was no attack on the smart contract. It was simply a multisig of supposedly 5 out of 9. And the attacker managed to take control of five validator keys. Four of them were managed by the same entity and were just stolen by good old email phishing. And the fifth one was a validator that had an open developer API that shouldn't have existed in production and allowed signing anything. So this goes to show us that not every bridge attack is a Web3 attack. Not every it could be just a good old key compromise, just bad key management, bad DevOps. So this is something also to keep in mind. So what can we learn from this? Now, there's a lot that bridges can do in order to be safer, to be more secure, but the previous talks already covered that, so I'm going to bring the point of view of the user. The market forgets really fast, and that's a problem. You can always, as a bridge, you can just rebrand and you're good to go. And so until all of us users start demanding, until we wake up and demand that that bridges be accountable for their security, we're going to see more bridges get hacked. So as users, I would urge you, first of all, if a bridge hasn't been audited on the latest version and including the initialization on chain, then it should not be used. Don't use that bridge. And if the bridge is a multi-sig, then then it's not even a Web3 project. It's just a trusted server. So certainly, please don't use this. Well, so as a users, users should just take control and decide carefully which bridges to use, not only based on fees but based on security. All right, thank you.